Hello, welcome to Documents and Details, a webinar and podcast series that explores the core documents of American history. Today we are joined by our host, John Moser of Ashland University, and panelists Eric Sands of Berry College and David Krugler of the University of Wisconsin-Platteville. In honor of the upcoming 2022 congressional elections, we've chosen to focus this episode on the evolution of party politics, and in particular, on the weakening of the party system. Join us as we dissect the 1912 platform of one of the most successful third parties in American history, the Progressives.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Moser. I am professor of history and chair of the Department of History and Political Science, as well as chair of the Master of Arts in American History and Government program at Ashland University. And I'd like to welcome you all to another episode of Documents in Detail, Teaching American History's webinar series, in which we bring together thoughtful scholars to have a conversation about historically significant documents. We encourage all of you joining us this evening to participate in that conversation by submitting questions via the Q&A box. Please stick to the Q&A box, not the chat box, so I don't have to go back and forth from place to place. We will get to as many of those questions as possible. Within the next week, you'll be receiving an email with links for further reading, as well as a link to the archived video and audio from tonight's program. The speeches, letters, and other writings that we're using for this year's webinars are all drawn from the various volumes of our core documents series. They're also available at the Teaching American History's extensive document database located at tah.org. The subject of our program this evening comes from the volume on political parties. Here it is, edited by Eric Sands. The document we'll be talking about is the Progressive Party Platform of 1912. And to help discuss it are Eric Sands himself. Eric is Associate Professor of Political Science and Department Chair of Political Science and International Affairs at Berry College, as well as David Krugler, Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin at Platteville. Both of these gentlemen are faculty members in Ashland University's master's program in American History and Government. But before we jump into this reading, I have a favor to ask. Would you please take a moment to answer the questions that are about to come up on your screen? Our staff at Teaching American History is trying to get a sense of what type of professional development we should offer to our webinar participants. Your feedback will help us to determine how best to serve our audience of educators. So I'm going to give you a minute or so to go through these, and we will resume our program. All right. So, Eric, Dave, glad to have you with us tonight.
Glad to be here.
Thank you, John.
Let's take a look at this document, which, if you have the book in front of you, I'm sure you've all looked this over. It starts on page 95 of the core documents volume. My question I want to direct primarily to Eric, though Dave, if you want to chime in, absolutely do so. In putting together this volume, right? Having edited one of these myself, I know that some difficult decisions go into what to include and what gets left out. Why does this document make the cut?
It is a really good illustration of a lot of the progressive thinking that went on in this period of time, 1896 to about 1916. And the first plank is, I think, the best illustration or concise illustration of the progressive attitude towards political parties. We see the antagonism, we see the blame that is foisted on the parties for much that is wrong with the political system, or at least what the progressives perceive as wrong with the political system. And I think it helps us go a long way towards understanding why the progressives wanted, at very least, to replace the existing party system, but I think at most to get rid of parties altogether and move us in the direction of something like direct democracy. When you read that beginning section on the old parties, you see in here the Progressive Party platform, saying the Republicans can't offer a solution. The Democrats are stuck in the past, and just can't get themselves adapted to contemporary American political life. And so we need to forge this new instrument of government through which to give effect to their will and laws and institutions. So it's a little unclear when you read the platform whether they're talking about the Progressive Party becoming a permanent part of American politics, or more in the vein that I think Jefferson saw the political party as a kind of temporary conduit to confront the threat of an opposition party. But once that opposition party was vanquished, we would move in the direction of probably, standing down and letting the party kind of dissolve and get back to a nonpartisan political system. Jefferson, of course, I think found the party too useful to actually get rid of it. But the progressives, I don't think, are on the Jeffersonian side of seeing parties as useful. They just see them as harmful.
Yeah. Dave, you have anything to add to that?
I do. I mean, I think it's an excellent choice, a must-include document. We see with the Progressive Party platform in 1912 a recurring feature of 20th century politics, dissatisfaction with the two-party system. And so for those seeking to understand George Wallace's appeal in 1968, or Ross Perot's in 1992, or even the breakaway from the Democratic Party by the States' Rights Party, led by Strom Thurmond in 1948, this document is a good starting point.
All right. Well, why don't we start out with some background to this? How did we get to this point where we have a party, a new party declaring itself? How do we get to Chicago, 1912?
Well, we have the consistent insulting of Taft to get us there by Teddy Roosevelt. So I think if there is the biggest regret of Teddy Roosevelt's life was his announcement in 1904 that he wouldn't run again, that he would honor the two-party principle, and I think he rued that the moment he left the White House. Add to it his growing dissatisfaction with what he saw as Taft's conservatism. And we're building toward a third party. So when La Follette says, well, I'm going to break away from the Republicans and pursue a more progressive agenda, Roosevelt wants to beat him to it.
I think that's an excellent summary of exactly how you end up there. Taft is just not perceived as progressive enough. It's not really that. I think it's fair to label him, an outright conservative. That he was moving us backwards from the gains that had been made in the progressive direction. I would squarely say that Taft was a progressive, but he wasn't a radical enough progressive. He wasn't pushing the more radical edges of progressivism the way that Teddy Roosevelt wanted to see him do, the way that progressives in the country wanted to see him do. And so he was seen as dragging his feet and too willing to play the old political games. He was willing to use the patronage to get what he wanted. He was willing to use party mechanisms in order to get legislation through that he favored. And for purist progressives, this was the antithesis of what politics should be about. There's a purity that should be in place there, and they rebelled against it. When Teddy Roosevelt announces that he's willing to run, he's a charismatic leader. He's got a lot of influence, and he draws a lot of people with him.
Dave, a minute ago you mentioned Wisconsin's favorite son, Robert La Follette. What role, if any, did he play in all of this?
Well, I think his biggest role is to inspire this move. I think for La Follette, Roosevelt running sidelines him, but he doesn't give up his presidential aspirations. He will run in 1924 and not do well at all. So clearly he's nursing those presidential ambitions. I think his other big role is to push the Republican Party toward the goals of progressivism. When you look at the specific points of the platform, this is a place that La Follette would be quite at home within.
Eric,
I'd add to that La Follette also was the one who put his toe over the line. He was the guy who said, all right, that's enough. I can't stay loyal to this party any longer. Something else has to take its place, which I think made it much easier for Roosevelt to take that turn in 1912. Roosevelt was very much a part of the Republican Party, and there was very, very likely going to be a real sense of betrayal if he went off in a third party direction. But La Follette, he's the precursor to this. There's already been a major defection. It makes it a lot easier for Roosevelt to do the same.
What did La Follette? I don't want to go off too far into discussing La Follette, although I find him a fascinating individual. What did Roosevelt and La Follette think of one another?
I'll defer to Eric on that one.
Yeah, I actually don't know a lot about their relationship. Teddy tended to have pretty strong opinions about people in general, but I have to admit I'm not really familiar with how well they got along or what kind of relationship they had.
They were both very strong personalities. It's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine that they would have coexisted very easily alongside one another. Well, we've got a few questions from our audience. Conrad Graff asks, is the Progressive Party's wish to remove political parties and move toward direct democracy? In that situation, wouldn't factions have still developed that would have led to political parties anyway?
That question really presents its own answer. Yes. And I think we see here the idealism and the optimism of the progressives. Eric used the word purity a little bit ago to describe the progressives and clinging to this idea that maybe this would just be a temporary shell, that they could move from having a formal party structure to just having direct, pure democracy. And that is a highly idealistic expectation. And as we see with La Follette and Roosevelt, factions do develop.
Yeah, I say in the essay that starts the book that it appears, given how much the framers emphasized the need for a nonpartisan political system and how hard they worked to try to make sure that parties wouldn't be needed in the political system, and the fact that parties show up almost immediately on the scene, that the only real conclusion we can make from that is that parties are inevitable in a Republican form of government. You can't exist without them, and it's not just that they're inevitable, but they're necessary. We actually need them. So yes, the progressives could have conceivably eliminated parties, but I don't think it would have lasted very long. I think parties would have reasserted themselves, would have reformed, and in very short order, we would have ended up with some sort of a party system as a result of it. Maybe two-party, maybe single party, maybe multi-party. That I don't know, but I have every confidence that parties would have reformed.
You said that we need political parties. Could you say more about what you mean by that?
Yeah. Direct democracy is nearly impossible in a large republic. You need something to organize the electorate. You need a mechanism that attaches the people to those who represent them. And especially in an era, in the 18th century and the 19th century, when we don't have the internet, when we don't have television and all of these other avenues where representatives can speak to the people, the parties really help to fill this void. They are that conduit that we need, that allows the representatives to know what their constituents want. It allows the constituents to know what their representatives are doing on their behalf. It factors into voter mobilization and getting people out to the polls and participating in politics. Something that we struggle with mightily right now in American politics. Just getting people out to vote. Well, in the era of strong parties, the parties did that real well. We're talking 70, 80% voter turnout. So the idea of democratic legitimacy being a problem, not really an issue when you have strong parties. It's only when the parties become weak that you start having those legitimacy problems.
I would add that a parallel we have with the necessity of parties in a large republic is the committee structure of Congress. The Constitution does not mention committees. Article 1 empowers Congress to govern its own affairs. We see the emergence of the committee structure and system almost immediately. And despite minor modifications, it is still adhering to a seniority system, which encourages career politicians and elected officials, for which a party system is useful.
Yeah, I think we talked about this last month when Eric, you and Abby Vector were talking about Tammany Hall, how in the 1912 really shows a weak voter turnout, certainly compared to the kind of turnout that you would have seen up through the 1890s, right? What does that tell us about the role that parties play, if I haven't answered my own question?
Well, yeah, I think that speaks, directly to, the value of parties in terms of political participation. And parties were extraordinary in the way that they were able to, marshal thousands, if not millions, of party workers to go out on election day and make sure that voters were, taking to the polls. I have a parties class right now that I'm teaching, and one of my students had said, "Oh yeah, but women weren't voting then." It's not as impressive that the parties were able to get, these high voter turnouts. I told the student, I don't think it would have mattered. If women had been voting, I still think the parties would have managed to get 70, 80% voter turnout. They were just that effective and that good at what they did. They had the resources, which of course came from a lot of corruption. But they had the resources and they had the organizational know-how to be able to marshal large numbers of people out to the polls and to keep them engaged on a regular basis. So it wasn't just engaging them on election day, it's engaging them in between elections, keeping them informed, keeping them, connected to the political system.
So we've gotten a kind of a backlog of questions. Let's see how many we can get to. Richard Rego asks, is it Taft's conservatism that incurred the ire of Roosevelt, I suppose, or his respect for the law that really caused the rift between the two of them?
I think for Roosevelt, Taft's problem was that he was so faithful to his idea of the rule of law that he became an inflexible thinker. And what we see Roosevelt emphasizing as president, and then once he leaves through his concept of new nationalism, is that the purpose of government is to serve the welfare of the people. And, that doesn't sound like a radical statement, but if we define government as a structure of laws, and in a republic, it should uphold the laws and make sure they apply equally. Well, we have competing notions of government then. They are at odds with one another. So we see Roosevelt proposing some very radical ideas in the New Nationalism and as a candidate in 1912, popular referenda to overrule the Supreme Court. And if you look at Taft's campaign speeches, and as Eric notes, Taft hated to campaign. I mean, he didn't like this part. I mean, he believed in parties, but he didn't want to do the work that was necessary to be a candidate from a party. But he keeps saying, we are a nation of laws. This has worked. We don't have to upend the apple cart. And I think that's what really bothered Roosevelt and led Roosevelt to see him as a conservative, whereas Taft sees himself as someone following the rule of law. And I suppose Taft would say, if that makes me a conservative, that I want to conserve the rule of law, so be it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think that was Taft's view. I think he was in favor of incremental change over time, as opposed to big radical change all at once. I think he believed that, a lot of the stuff that we see in the Progressive Party platform of 1912, was sort of beyond the scope of what was allowed in constitutional democracy, at least without amending the Constitution, which of course the progressives want to make very easy to do. And this is just completely out of alignment with the whole ideas of limited government, and that needs to be preserved.
I think my favorite example of Taft's fealty to the law is his aggressive pursuit, or the aggressive pursuit by his Justice Department of antitrust. And Roosevelt thought, well, wait a minute, there are good trusts and bad trusts, and Taft says, well, essentially, show me where it says that, the Sherman antitrust law. It says combinations in restraint of trade have to be broken up. It doesn't say the ones that we like don't, are exempt from that. Eric Sellat asks here, when the document says they, presumably the progressives, wanted democratic socialism, did they mean the Bernie Sanders form of democratic socialism? What was their idea of democratic socialism?
Well, we need to keep the progressives firmly rooted in their time of over 100 years ago. And if we want to draw parallels to progressives of today or self-identified democratic socialists, we want to look for the common factors in our society and politics today with those of the progressives. So for the progressives, the effects of industrialization were paramount. I mean, you see again and again in this platform, but also in progressive speeches and in the rhetoric of Roosevelt and of Wilson too, who we haven't brought in, but perhaps deserves mention since he's a candidate in 1912 and he's the one who wins. And they're saying pursuit of happiness is not possible when industrial corporations immiserate so many workers, and government needs to step up and put in wage laws and set minimum requirements for conditions and provide compensation for those hurt on the job, and so on. So if we see parallels with advocacy today for such policies, yes, there's a similarity, but the progressives are dealing with a world that has raised the standard of living, but brought so much upheaval because of industrialization, and immigration is transforming the country. I mean, those are just two notable differences with our own times that we should be mindful of.
Yeah, that's a good point. When I read through the platform of 1912, I really read the New Deal. I really read the precursor to the New Deal. I see Social Security in there. I see, a lot of elements that FDR is going to bring about with the help of a major crisis that is going to help legitimize a lot of these things that the progressives don't get. I guess the interesting question is, how much would these progressives have embraced the Great Society? Would the Great Society's principles have been something that would mesh with progressivism? I think the answer is at least some of them would be. Certainly, progressives today still advocate policies out of concern for inequities in the marketplace, which is, I think, very analogous to what progressives were worried about in 1912. The social justice and the environmental pieces and things like that, I think those are harder to say. I mean, TR, certainly conservation, a big environmental theme going on with him. Was that shared by other progressives, outside of that? A little harder to say. You do notice when you read through the platform of 1912, there's nothing on race. That's a big omission that you see in here. So the connection between these progressives and the progressives of the 1960s, who were very concerned, of course, with race and dealing with the pernicious effects of segregation, that didn't seem to really get on their radar in 1912.
Yeah, that's a great point. And the one candidate who is talking about race in 1912 is the alleged conservative. It's Taft, and he's speaking to the African American electorate, those able to vote. The majority of African Americans live in the South, and voting rights stripped by 1912 for the most part. But in Elkton, Maryland, Taft says, the progressives get their way. If you allow the tampering with the Constitution, they're going to go after, or somebody's going to go after the 14th and 15th Amendments, and that's going to affect African Americans. So, he's making an appeal to a portion of the electorate that's still loyal to the Republican Party, and saying you need to be aware of the consequences here of these changes if they get their way.
I had never heard of that speech before. I want to look into that. It really is interesting. W.E.B. Du Bois famously endorses Wilson, and right. Something that he would really regret later on. But Du Bois didn't find much to choose from among the field of candidates. But I wasn't aware that Taft had made that kind of outreach. But it certainly is the case that African Americans stuck with those who were able to vote, which was a pretty small number of them. But I do know that they stuck with the Republican Party. Something else that struck me as Eric was talking about the difference between the progressives of today, or maybe the progressives of the 1960s and onward, versus the progressives of this period, is you don't see the kind of emphasis on personal freedom and personal liberation that's often associated with modern progressivism. I mean, if you read a lot of Theodore Roosevelt, you don't see talk of freedom much at all. It's always talk about duties that we have to society. Do either of you have any thoughts on that?
Well, when he talks about the new nationalism, Roosevelt says this is important. I mean, we have to have limited hours, and this is a big part of the document we're discussing. And Roosevelt explains it this way: we need people to be able to go home from work and have free time, and to participate in their communities. So, he's talking about free time and more freedom, but then as you noted, John, he's bringing it back to a duty, but saying this allows people to become good citizens. If they're working all the time and exhausted, they can't engage, and that's not true freedom. That's not republicanism.
Yeah, I think there's also a certain sense that embedded in progressive philosophy, the early progressives, is this kind of distrust of individualism and this distrust of individual rights, or the emphasis on individual rights. There's more of this placement. I think of Crowley in this, talking more about devotion to the common good and the general welfare, and needing to get people out of their individualistic mindsets. So for them, talk of liberation and those kinds of things is perhaps leading us back to that more individualist way of thinking. And maybe we're a little less willing to embrace that in 1912 or in that early progressive era. But later on, this becomes more of a concern of individuals being able to experience personal liberation and personal freedom. And so it becomes more of an emphasis for progressives later.
Eric Sollet has asked another question, and I'm kind of jumping the queue a bit because it directly refers back to something we were talking about just a moment ago. What was going on for the progressives that they didn't address the topic of race?
I think the progressives are just so focused on industrial problems and what the role of government is that they're not understanding how determinant race is in what happens in American politics. I mean, they kind of brush up against it when they accuse the Democratic Party of being neglectful of the people, and when they talk about the major differences between states. But you'll notice in the document when they talk about how a worker can have a very different life from one state compared to the next, they're doing so from this position that industrialization and the negative effects are the true problem. I mean, you could take that same framework and say, why is it that African Americans can vote in Ohio, but if they cross south and get to Kentucky or further south, they can't vote? That's a problem the progressives could have talked about, but I think they were just so focused on these macro problems brought by industrialization that they weren't interested.
Yeah, that's the piece I'd emphasize. I think they just weren't interested. I think for them, race was either an issue too far, in terms of an intractable problem that they didn't think that they could really make much in the way of inroads into, or most cynically, they were probably racist themselves and didn't really care about it all that much.
And just to add to that quickly, if we're talking about race in 1912, we also need to understand that the term race encompassed lots of Europeans who were not considered white. And there's a great deal of concern. You've got the Dillingham Commission around this time, and the proposal for comprehensive restrictive immigration targeting nationalities and ethnicities from Europe deemed to be inferior to the Germanic, Scandinavian, Anglo-Saxon type. So the conceptions of race that are prevalent at the time are different than our own today, and one can see that in Roosevelt himself.
Yeah, one thing I would add, even though Roosevelt was the first, as president, was the first president to have a black man at the White House, and that was Booker. Was that Booker T. Washington or Oscar de Priest? I think it was Booker T. Washington.
It was Booker T. Washington.
Yeah, for which he got lots of criticism from whites. Roosevelt himself was a believer in racial theory. So he was certainly not a believer in the equality of the races. I had also read that he was convinced that there were Southern progressives who could be won over to his cause. But the one way that he could really ruin that is by supporting rights for African Americans, because white progressives in the South would have all, been convinced in the desirability of segregation. Joseph Giuliano asks, was there ever any discussion about amending the Constitution in ways that would encourage a multi-party system? That's a good question.
Well, in their platform, the progressives say we've got to make it easier to amend the Constitution. And although they don't give it that specific purpose, certainly that's an intention, that's a possibility. And Eric, maybe you can say more about what they specifically thought should be done in the Constitution to make amendments easier, because it's not spelled out in the document. Maybe they wanted to keep it vague.
Yeah, I think the intention was to sort of keep it vague, and probably change some of the 3/4 requirements for the states, knock that down to 2/3 or majority or something like that. Perhaps bring down the 2/3 requirements in Congress to simple majority, something like that. But I'm unaware of any amendment that they were talking about proposing to move us toward a multi-party system. I mean, given that parties are so problematic, it's kind of unclear how more of them is going to make things better. Right. So two are kind of bad enough. 3 or more, and we have a huge mess on our hands. So no, I don't think they ever entertained anything like an idea that a multi-party system would be better.
Joe Rooney asks, how influential was the Progressive Party in moving the country toward adopting women's suffrage and direct election of U.S. senators? Or were the desire for these amendments already incubating in the party system?
If I remember correctly, the first proposal for a constitutional amendment for the direct election of senators came out of the House in the mid-1880s, and just couldn't get through the Senate for obvious reasons. So that idea had been percolating for some time. The populists call for the direct election of senators in 1892, so 10 years earlier. That's a part of a third party's official program.
Yeah, so David's right. There's precursors to this. This has already been proposed. This has already been talked about, and certainly women's suffrage has become a major social movement. But I would say the progressives are important in kind of providing focus on these issues and really mobilizing voters and mobilizing the electorate in support of both measures, and ultimately being able to get them past as constitutional amendments.
I was a little surprised to see the reference in the platform to the direct election of senators, because I believe that by 1912, it was already a done deal as far as Washington was concerned. It was just out among the states. It hadn't been ratified by enough states. So, yeah, it seems strange to me that part of their national platform is pushing for something that had already been established. Do you know anything about any insight on that?
I mean, it goes into effect it's ratified in 1913. So yeah, it would have to be out by then, the same year as the income tax. Those are the 16th and 17th amendments. Yeah,
and what I know about the election of 1912, that never comes up as an issue. I mean, Taft is all for it. He had, but it wasn't even before anyone in Washington. Anyway, Kimberly Kowalski asks, would it be fair to say that the progressives believed that the country belonged to the people, and they were the ones who were most interested in the public welfare? What did the progressives think of states' rights?
I think, yes, absolutely. they see the government as representing the welfare of the people. I mean, this is Roosevelt's consistent message. And they are wary of, they don't mention the 10th Amendment, but you get a sense the progressives are suspicious of that amendment because of the way it empowers states. So when they talk about the need to have uniform laws regulating workplace conditions and wages, that's running roughshod over states' rights, and they're looking to the federal government to carry this out. So states' rights are an obstacle to the progressives for most of their goals.
Yeah, the progressives seize control of the Commerce Clause. They seize control of the taxing power and use those as ways of overriding federalism in the Constitution. And in their platform, in the plank on nation and state, I think they very clearly take a stand against the states in favor of the national government. So he says, up to the limit of the Constitution and later by amendment of the Constitution, if found necessary, we advocate bringing under effective national jurisdiction those problems which have expanded beyond the reach of the individual states. So national jurisdiction over national problems, and stop, having the states try to regulate child labor because they can't do it. We need to turn this over to the national government. But that final statement, the extreme insistence on states' rights by the Democratic Party in the Baltimore platform, demonstrates anew its inability to understand the world into which it has survived, or to administer the affairs of a union of states which have in all essential respects become one people. So we're not really a nation of states anymore. We've really become a single nation that needs a single government to administer public affairs and to pursue the common good.
I'm not remembering now. They make reference to the Baltimore platform, so I guess that means that the Democratic convention had already occurred, or had the platform been drafted before that? And there's a reason why I'm asking this. I had read that Roosevelt thought his only real shot at being elected was if the Democrats elected a conservative rather than someone like Wilson. And as soon as Wilson was the nominee, he kind of, not that he had any particular respect for Wilson, but Wilson was significantly progressive, that it destroyed Roosevelt's idea that he was going to draw all the progressives of both major parties into this alliance. Do either of you know anything about that?
Well, the date on this document is November 5th, 1912. So this must be a very late revision of the platform released to have impact upon the vote. So I don't know the earlier incarnations, but I would suspect that that reference to Baltimore came later after the Democrats' convention.
Yeah, I'm almost positive that the progressive convention came before the Democratic convention. Yeah. Eric, you have anything on this?
I'm not entirely sure what the dates are on them actually, but the tickle I have in the back of my brain seems to remind me that the progressive convention did come first.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Thanks. Gloria Sesso asks a question that I think the progressives themselves might have asked. Do not parties encourage an elite power group at the top, and don't they think of the power of the party rather than the good of the people at large?
Well, parties can do that. I don't know that they have to do that. But some of this is a consequence of parties becoming so big in the 19th century. I mean, these become organizations with millions and millions of members. And you just can't run an organization like that democratically. It just doesn't work. You can't have them all casting a vote for a nominee. and totaling up the votes and deciding, which candidate is going to get the nomination at that point, or, having millions of members participating in writing a party platform. It can't happen. And so, power has to become more centralized, and the organizational structure has to become more hierarchical. And that's exactly what happened with the parties. The power starts to, move upward into the hands of the party bosses. They're making more and more decisions on behalf of everybody, and that trickles down to everybody else in the party. And they do become very corrupted in the process. They aggrandize themselves. They get in bed with the corporate trusts. It really does become a mess of these elites not really catering to the needs of the people. So, I mean, that part of the critique was right. The question is whether parties have to operate this way or whether it had to turn out like this. And I think some of that comes down to statesmanship, the type of leaders that you put in place and give power to. And I think in many cases, the parties just made bad decisions about who was placed in charge and who had power, instead of, people who might have been more concerned about the common good and more concerned, like in the populist era, of the plight of the people.
I think the progressives see political parties at this time as little more than corporations. And the platform speaks of parties as if they can be regulated in the same ways corporations can be regulated. They have some pretty big proposals for placing limits on the parties. And that's shows an interesting outlook on them. I mean, they're fitting everything into this view of America as being ground up by industrialization. I mean, political parties are, and the way people express themselves through them. I mean, that gets to the vote and it gets to free speech issues. But the progressives want to limit the power of parties and the power of interest groups to influence the parties. I mean, so there's some language in this document that sounds very modern, certainly very familiar. It's calling for the registration of lobbyists, which, if we look at it from another way, is placing a burden on someone's commercial activity, right? I mean, if this is what they do for a living, this is their economic endeavor, why is a particular restriction placed on them? But for the progressives, this is necessary for the welfare of the people.
Yeah, they talk about campaign finance reform as well, and which is an issue we're still grappling with in contemporary politics. Although I would point out, for all of these party reforms that they're specifically arguing for, the most effective ones were the Australian ballot, civil service reform, and primaries. These were the things that did more damage to the political parties than anything else.
I want to ask, since we're coming toward the end of our time, why didn't the progressives have more success in 1912 than they did? And because in fact, the party didn't last very long. And why do they still matter? Or what difference did they make, given how seemingly unsuccessful they were?
Well, I would say they build on the foundation provided by the populists and make possible some major reforms in terms of how the parties operate in the primaries. As Eric noted, they provide a foundation for social insurance. As Eric said at the top of the hour, there's so much that sounds like the New Deal here. So they matter just for that reason, because the New Deal harkens back so much to this platform and to the goals of the progressive. So even if they don't make it as a political party, they greatly influence the two durable, long-lasting parties.
Yeah, I agree with that. the progressives introduced an entirely new way of thinking about American politics. They give us the living Constitution, something that is embraced by every student that I have in Intro to American Government. That the Constitution needs to be adapted and changed to keep up with the times. And I mean, this is a very progressive idea. I mean, this is something you find in lots of progressive writings. And certainly the progressive policies that are advocated, they don't all come to fruition in the 1910s and the 1920s, but we do see an awful lot of them show up in the New Deal or after. So they do end up making a pretty significant mark on American politics. To the other part of your question, why don't they have more success? Well, in a way, I think part of the answer to that question, I think there's a lot of answers to that question, but part of the answer to that question is that they refuse to embrace themselves being a political party. They don't get out there and raise money. They don't get out there and mobilize. They don't get out there and, try to rally the troops and, do all of the things that parties need to do to win elections. To a certain extent, I have always perceived the progressives as being more of a social movement than a political party. That becoming a party is in a way kind of selling out. And by the way, I would say there's kind of an analogy to be made with the Tea Party in that same way. Many members of the Tea Party were very, very reluctant to move in the direction of becoming a formal political party. Because they thought they would sell out on the purity of their principles if they embraced party politics. So I think that's one of the things that ends up hurting them in 1912.
Okay. Let's see. We have very little time left. Andrew Nappy asks an interesting question. What part of the progressive platform in 1912 would most Americans have considered the most radical, and why?
The proposal for overriding courts. That's an idea that just didn't get a lot of traction. And, and Eric can probably speak to this better than I can, but I wonder if it's not so much that people like Taft are saying, we've always had the court system this way. This is what's important, but court decisions, weren't followed as they are today. And so I think just, most Americans don't have direct encounter with the effects of Supreme Court decisions or state court decisions. So I think they would have found it to be a radical one to change something they don't really understand well.
I'd agree with that. I think that would probably be the one that Americans would find most controversial. I'd maybe toss out as well making the Constitution easier to amend, although there are Americans today who do want to see the Constitution easier to amend. But I think a lot of Americans would find this somewhat troubling, that the fundamental law of the land could be altered by a simple majority in Congress, or whatever the progressive plan was for making that happen. That the document needs a little more permanence and needs a little firmer foundation than that.
When we have an example from the New Deal of a radical progressive idea backfiring, and that's Franklin Roosevelt's court packing idea, where he comes up with this very complex formula for expanding the Supreme Court, and it's clearly engineered to drive out older conservative justices who have been ruling against the New Deal, and that's just a step too far for Roosevelt. He's just won re-election to a third term, but that's no mandate to restructure the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court's, the number of justices isn't set in the Constitution, but there's always been, or supposed to be, 9 justices since very early on, and I think Roosevelt's own supporters thought, no, we should not tamper with an institution that is working just because you're not happy with the results in a given moment.
This maybe end up being our last question, but there are actually two questions that have been asked that I think naturally go together. One of them is, were the progressives eventually absorbed into the Democratic Party? The other is, isn't Wilson a progressive? My students think he is.
Yes and yes. Yeah, Wilson's certainly a progressive.
Yes, I agree. I think Wilson's a progressive. I've never really understood the argument that he's some sort of conservative. That's just never made any sense to me. But I would say, to the first part of the question, I think the progressives are initially absorbed into both political parties. I think it's really the case, the Republicans had already become progressive by 1912, and the Democrats become progressive under Wilson. And then, as we start moving into the 1920s and the 1930s, these progressive ideas that are not initially picked up, then as we go into the, Harding and, normalcy and all these other kinds of things, it's the Democrats who really, run with the progressive agenda during the New Deal. So I think, yes, they eventually become the progressive party.
Right. And Warren G. Harding is so often presented as the Republican president who takes the country back to normalcy. And certainly when you look at his campaign rhetoric in 1920, he is anti-reform. He is hammering home the message that Americans are tired of reform. And yet during his first year in office, he signs the Shepard-Towner Act, which provides federal funds for visiting nurses, good mother programs, infant care, all to lower the rate of infant mortality in the country. This is straight up progressivism, and Harding signs it.
Yeah, I always thought there was at least an article, perhaps a book, on the extent to which progressivism persisted in the 1920s. And I'm not talking about Robert La Follette's 1924 campaign. Right. The progressive ethos suffused everything, even at a time when somebody like Calvin Coolidge, whose rhetoric is directly anti-progressive, progressivism is just kind of in many ways regarded as common sense. We have reached the end of our time. Do either of you care to make a final statement about this document? Something that that those in attendance might want to remember? Not that everything you said isn't worth remembering, but
I would say use this document alongside of Teddy Roosevelt's New Nationalism, 1910, which is also in the collection. They make a good pairing.
Yeah, and I included this to show the transition point from America with strong parties to America with weak parties, and I think it's a really good way of understanding where a lot of the modern and contemporary mindset or dislike of political parties comes from. And maybe a reason why we want to do something about that, because I happen to have a very positive view of parties.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank both of our panelists, Eric and David. I also want to thank our participants for their questions. As a reminder, you'll be receiving an email within the next week. That email will include a link for further readings. It will also contain a link to the archived webinar. We really hope that you'll share that with your colleagues and get it out there on social media. If you've enjoyed tonight's webinar, please consider taking an online graduate course or an in-person graduate course in our Master of Arts in American History and Government program. As I said at the outset, both of these gentlemen teach in that program, as do I. You can find more information about our course offerings, as well as all sorts of other resources for teachers at teachingamericanhistory.org. Our next edition of Documents in Detail will take place on Wednesday, November 16th. At that time, we'll be talking about the Pacificus-Helvidius debate of 1793-1794. That comes from our Core Documents volume on American Foreign Policy to 1899. And joining us then will be that volume's editor, Steve Knott of the United States Naval War College, and William Addo of the University of Dallas. So thanks again to all of you for being with us tonight. We'll look forward to seeing you again next month.
Thank you all.
Good night.
Thanks again for listening to Teaching American History's webinar on the Progressive Party platform of 1912. For more information on our webinars, in-person educator professional development programs, free document library, and graduate program, please visit us at tah.org.